Elizabeth Warren didn't expect the first blow to come so hard. It wasn't from the media or from the activists. It came from someone right in the room. A man who waited until every camera was on and every microphone live. Senator John Kennedy stood firm, his voice sharp and clear. "Common sense is illegal in Washington, D.C., he said, cutting through the silence. And today, someone has broken that law. There were no soft introductions or careful diplomacy. Kennedy had a clear target, and it was her. Warren stiffened slightly, the microphone trembling in her hand. Not from fear, but from knowing this was going to be a fight. She had underestimated the room. It was full of aides, lobbyists, and reporters pretending not to listen. Kennedy continued, speaking with precision like someone who knew exactly how to land his points. He reminded everyone why they were here. President Trump had made a promise to go through every line of the federal budget. No line would be protected. He wasn't joking, Kennedy explained. Trump issued an executive order and appointed someone who could actually do it. Elon Musk, a man who didn't need political approval to operate and had top-level clearance. The words hit like a hammer. Warren leaned in, responding quickly, her voice laced with sarcasm. "No one is afraid of an audit if there's nothing to hide," she said. "But this isn't an audit. It's political revenge dressed up as budget oversight. This isn't about logic. It's about sabotage." The gallery buzzed with whispers. Kennedy didn't reply right away. He just smiled, the kind of smile that let everyone know the worst was still coming. He moved toward the center of the room and let the silence settle in. Then, casually, he said, "We'll let the facts speak for themselves, and I suggest everyone fasten their seatbelts, because the facts won't be as polite as I'm being right now." A few gasps were heard. Even the stenographer paused for a moment. The debate lines weren't theoretical anymore. They were being drawn right there with each word. The room was tense. It was clear. This wasn't a debate. It was a breakdown of the facts. And Elizabeth Warren was about to learn what happens when truth walks into a room ruled by hypocrisy. Kennedy didn't pause. He pivoted, smooth and calculated, like a surgeon cutting through a problem. He began exposing what he called the sacred cow of international aid, USAID. He described it as a program that employed 10,000 people, handled $40 billion a year, and somehow sent much of it to broken, unstable places like Yemen, Syria, and Afghanistan. The room prepared for impact. But Warren stood her ground. She jumped in like a self-declared warrior. Her voice, often heard scolding banks or baking fundraiser pies, now carried a new fury. "Not everyone," she snapped, "is used to life among billionaires in tech boardrooms. Some of us are saving real lives, and saving lives doesn't always come with a profit." There it was, the usual emotional appeal, Kennedy thought. Wrapping morality and victimhood dipped in righteous anger. He didn't flinch. "Saving lives," he repeated, his tone dry enough to start a fire. "By funding the Taliban? Do you have an actual budget for that, Senator? Or just another slogan made to impress people at cocktail parties?" Warren's expression faltered for a split second. Then she fired back harder. "USAID helps vulnerable communities. We don't design programs for billionaires who avoid taxes. We stand for people, not profits." The room trembled with the energy of her words. But Kennedy stood calmly, hands behind his back like a professor waiting for a noisy classroom to settle down. And when it did, he answered, without raising his voice, but with undeniable force. "The real question," Kennedy said slowly, "isn't who needs help. It's who is helping themselves to the wallets of the American people and deciding, like untouchable elites, whose suffering matters and whose doesn't." The words landed like a slap. Somewhere in the back, a junior aide fumbled their notepad. A journalist clicked their pen a little too loud. The moral platform Warren had tried to build was already showing cracks. Because in Kennedy's version of America, the one he claimed to represent, the issue wasn't that people didn't care. It was that a small elite cared too much about controlling how everyone else cared, and who got to profit from that guilt. The room was thick with tension. You could almost smell the frustration, manufactured outrage starting to lose its grip. Kennedy stood firm. The idea that U.S. foreign aid was a kind-hearted project was giving way to a harsher picture. one of inefficiency, corruption, and misused funds. What was sold as compassion now looked like a system built to reward failure. He didn't need to shout. His calm made everything worse for Warren. Then with a pause, Kennedy flipped the page. $1.5 million, he read, to support an LGBTQ group in Serbia. His voice sharpened. $20 million for a Sesame Street production in Iraq. And, he said, flipping another page, $4.5 million to fight misinformation in Kazakhstan. Because apparently, free speech in Central Asia now needs babysitting from our tax dollars. The gallery shifted. A few people laughed under their breath, but Warren didn't give them the chance to enjoy it. She slammed a binder down. The microphones shook. Those programs, she said, voice crisp, were approved by regional security teams, human rights experts, and the U.S. State Department, not by billionaires who think owning a social media site makes them kings of democracy. Kennedy looked up from his notes and let the silence build. Then softly and with a touch of sarcasm, he asked, "So, exporting Sesame Street is now national security?" Warren leaned forward, unshaken. "I'm saying building cultural bridges is important," she said. "We don't look at the world as just profit margins and tax shelters." Kennedy gave a short, cold laugh. "Cultural bridges," he repeated, "built with taxpayer money and no oversight." He turned to the next page. "And what about the $7.9 million used to train journalists in Sri Lanka, not to use binary gender terms? Was that bridge vital to the war on terror?" Warren's jaw clenched. "It's a human rights initiative," she said, her voice now tighter. "More like a teacher scolding a student than a senator defending policy." Kennedy tapped his pen against the table, his tone measured but piercing. "So now, the right of tax agents to police language is more important than the right of taxpayers to know where their money is going?" Warren replied fast, not letting him build momentum. "You're oversimplifying complex humanitarian work into political punchlines," she said. "The world isn't a ledger, Mr. Kennedy." He leaned in, slightly lowering his voice. "No, Senator. But when the total hits billions, all wasted overseas while our cities fall apart here at home, maybe it's time someone did start treating it like one." Reporters began writing faster. Aides traded looks. Warren looked ready to respond, but Kennedy didn't stop. He leaned forward, speaking like he was revealing something the whole room needed to hear. "Tell me, Senator," he said, "when was the last time one of these grants helped a struggling farmer in Kansas or a public school teacher in Detroit?" Warren opened her mouth, but no sound came. Her hand tightened on her binder. "And yet," Kennedy continued, voice quieter now, "millions go to rainbow campaigns in countries that barely have electricity." The silence was thick. This wasn't just a disagreement about aid anymore. This was about control. Who makes the choices and who gets to hide behind? Words like progress while the money disappears. The room hadn't fully settled when Kennedy spoke again. His tone was steady, slow, and cold, like a surgeon announcing a diagnosis. "Russia," he said. "We're not just talking about wasted spending anymore. We're talking about funding. Terrorism." The words hit hard. No drama, just the solid impact of facts no one wanted to confront. Then with precision, Kennedy read the figures aloud like he was listing casualties. $122 million to organizations linked to Hamas. $10 million in food aid quietly redirected to a group tied to Al-Qaeda. Specifically, the NRA front, a different kind of silent spread. This wasn't just about politics or policy anymore. This was serious. This was about lives. Warren stood abruptly, angry and determined. She slammed her hand against the table. Microphones rattled. "USAID works with local nonprofit partners," she said, her voice sharp. "These organizations go through strict checks. We know there are risks in global humanitarian work, but we take those risks seriously." Kennedy tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to hear whether she had just admitted they were funding terrorists, or if she just thought yelling made it sound better. "A risk?" he repeated, rolling the word around like it was spoiled meat. "So transferring $122 million to Hamas is a risk? Or is it willful ignorance dressed up as reasonable doubt?" This time Warren didn't hesitate. She lifted a report and dropped it on the table, firm like an attorney presenting evidence. Independent audits confirm that USAID funding goes through multiple oversight layers, she said. No money is approved without checks. Kennedy smiled slowly, grimly. On paper, he replied. Meanwhile, real bodies are piling up in alleys and marketplaces. His voice dropped lower, now cold and controlled. The American people don't need certificates of good intentions. They need the truth. And the truth is this: dead civilians aren't the price of compassion. They're the cost of arrogance signed into law by people too scared to question their own talking points. Warren opened her mouth, then closed it. The gallery went silent. This was no longer a debate on programs or aid. It was something else. A moment of reckoning. Elizabeth Warren, known for fiery speeches and defending the underdog, suddenly looked like someone trapped defending the indefensible, justifying death with bureaucracy. Kennedy leaned back. The point had been made, but he wasn't done. He flipped the next page, then he shifted tone, not louder but quieter. The room leaned in. "Senator," he said, his voice level and focused, "do you know where $2.7 trillion in Medicare and Medicaid payments went?" Warren blinked, not because she didn't expect the question, but because she hoped he wouldn't ask it this way. "Medicare and Medicaid are huge, complex systems," she replied, her tone brisk. "During the pandemic, emergency payments had to be made quickly. Some mistakes were bound to happen." Kennedy nodded as if giving her room to breathe. Then he tightened the focus. "Mistakes?" he echoed. "So how would you explain this number? $4.7 trillion in federal spending that can't be traced to any official source." Warren's eyes narrowed. "That spending reflects emergency actions taken during a global crisis," she said. "We prioritized saving lives and keeping the economy stable." "How generous," Kennedy replied, the sarcasm razor thin, all without receipts, signatures, or records. Just a broken ATM and an open vault. Warren tensed. "Would you rather we did nothing? That we let everything collapse?" People were dying. Kennedy's voice turned icy. "No, I would have preferred we helped people, without turning it into a laundering operation." He stood, not to shout, but to speak clearly and directly. Fast response doesn't mean grabbing every taxpayer's wallet and throwing it into the air, hoping some of it lands where it's needed. He took a step forward. The American people didn't ask for miracles, they asked for help. What they got was legalized looting dressed up as empathy. Warren opened her mouth to argue, but hesitated. Kennedy didn't stop. "You call it an emergency response," he said. "Fine, but if someone robs a bank during a hurricane, do we call that disaster relief?" The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't respectful. It was heavy, unavoidable. Kennedy had flipped the narrative. What had been labeled as urgent spending now sounded more like unchecked power. Each dollar that couldn't be tracked left a bitter question hanging in the air. Kennedy was no longer flipping pages or pointing to charts. He spoke like someone who had seen this pattern before, like a man watching the same story play out again. Only now the price tag was too high to ignore. "For 12 years, he said slowly, under President Obama and now under President Biden, we've operated a political carnival, one built on asking the wrong question." He paused and scanned the room. It was never, "Where did the money go?" It was always, "Who needs to pay more?" He didn't need to raise his voice. The message cut through clean and sharp. Warren responded quickly, ready this time. "And by asking that question," she said, "we've educated children, housed families, provided health care. That's progress, even if it doesn't fit on a campaign poster." Kennedy tilted his head as if weighing her answer. Then he stood straighter, his tone turning surgical. "If progress means billions spent overseas on gender campaigns, funding kids' shows in war zones and propping up groups linked to militants, then I ask, whose version of justice are we funding?" Warren leaned forward, her patience thinning. "We are not funding Hamas," she said. "We are supporting civilians caught in crossfire." Kennedy didn't blink. "This isn't about whether aid is necessary. It's about who decides how that aid is handed out, and what justification we use to support it." He stepped forward, not in anger but with focus. "Somewhere along the way, Senator, we stopped asking what's right. Instead, we ask what's politically safe. We stopped measuring aid by real results and started celebrating success through hashtags and media briefings. Warren looked ready to respond, but Kennedy was still building momentum. While America is bleeding at home, our so-called moral leadership is busy giving lectures to foreign journalists about pronouns. Warren tried to speak up, but he pressed on. This isn't about facts, he said. It's about who defines them, who controls the message, stamps it as official, and sells it to the public as moral truth. He looked straight at her. This isn't budgeting. This is about power. And just like that, the room shifted again. This was no longer a debate over spending. It had become something deeper, a trial over trust. Kennedy wasn't just confronting a senator. He was challenging the entire era of how decisions had been made. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When truth feels heavy enough, it doesn't have to be loud. He let the silence sit just a moment longer than usual. Then he delivered. The next blow, quietly, directly. Americans don't just pay taxes, he said, each word firm. They hand over their trust. Trust that their sacrifice will lead to progress, not be traded away. He paused, staring straight across the table. So tell me, Senator Warren, who broke that trust? He didn't wait for her to answer. Instead, he continued with cold precision, lifting another sheet of paper. $2 million, he read. For gender transition surgeries in Guatemala. He turned the page without looking up. $8 million for non-binary media training in Sri Lanka. The words dropped like weights. Even Warren's aides stopped writing for a moment. Warren straightened her stack of documents, her hands trembling slightly. The world is changing, she said, sharper than intended. We must meet modern needs. We can't judge current problems with outdated thinking. Kennedy gave a short nod, almost kind. So this, he said, motioning broadly, is what modern values look like? While Americans drown in student debt, their money funds gender campaigns in Sri Lanka? Warren's jaw tightened. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Finally, she snapped back. You're twisting the facts for your political gain. Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He simply leaned forward and placed the document on the table with a calm, steady hand, like he was laying down evidence. I'm not twisting anything, he said quietly. I'm reading the numbers. Numbers you signed off on. There was no applause, no gasps, just a growing realization in the room. The emotional defense Warren had relied on was crumbling. The shield of moral language wasn't enough anymore. Beneath the slogans and intentions, there were numbers, and those numbers were now in the spotlight. Warren, once firm and commanding, now looked different. For the first time, it seemed the audience wasn't convinced by her words. They weren't responding to emotion or politics. They were listening to the facts. Kennedy's tone didn't change. He no longer sounded like someone presenting a case. He sounded like a prosecutor unveiling a crime scene. Each word became part of a larger picture, and with each fact, the space between Warren and the audience grew wider. He turned to the easel next to him and flipped open a chart. Not a colorful diagram, but a roadmap of red flags. It looked more like a crime board than a budget outline. Lines connected USAID to NGOs, offshore accounts, and international programs. The titles read like a checklist of bureaucratic failure: CFPB, UNICEF subsidiaries, vague resilience funds, each tied to millions in taxpayer money, with little to no oversight. Kennedy tapped the chart once. The sound echoed. Tell me, Senator Warren, he asked in a calm tone, is this what the American people agreed to? Did they think their taxes would go to help the poor, or to create a system of middlemen where the money disappears, and the needy remain poor while someone in Brussels buys a Tesla? Warren leaned in, trying to hold her ground. These are just claims, she said firmly. There's no solid evidence behind that. Kennedy didn't act surprised. He picked up a single sheet and held it up with 2 fingers, letting everyone, the room, see it. $711 million, he read, sitting in unused USAID reserve accounts. $825 million in new funding requests, submitted without congressional approval. No audits, no clear oversight, no explanation. He let the page fall onto the table. The sound was soft, but somehow louder than anything else said so far. This isn't a theory, Kennedy said. It's simple math. Warren opened her mouth, but no words came. She gripped her documents tightly, knuckles turning white. Her eyes darted briefly around the room, searching for something, or someone to help her, but there was nothing, only silence. In that moment, the weight of the facts became too much to ignore. No argument about good intentions could stand. Up to the raw data Kennedy laid out. The numbers had taken control of the room. Kennedy didn't smile. He didn't need to. The facts were doing the damage. He didn't change his tone. He didn't give any warnings. He just went straight to the heart of the issue. "Senator Warren," he said, his voice calm and icy, "you make $174,000 a year as a member of Congress. Can you explain how your personal net worth has grown to somewhere between $12 million and $73 million? The question dropped like a hammer. The room froze. Warren blinked. She looked like she had been hit. For the first time, her hands visibly trembled as she rearranged the papers in front of her. I have saved," she began, her voice shaky. "I've invested legally." The confidence she had earlier was gone, broken into uneven pieces. Kennedy leaned in closer, tightening the grip of his words. "Legally," he echoed. "Of course. But saved from what, Senator? From your salary? Your book deals? Or maybe—" He paused, letting the silence stretch. "From access to the kind of money regular Americans don't even know exists?" Warren's lips moved, but no words came out. Her eyes dropped to her papers, scanning them as if the answers might be hidden there. She didn't speak, and the silence that followed didn't feel peaceful. It felt like judgment. Kennedy didn't rush. He let the stillness settle in, filling the room with a pressure more powerful than shouting. Around the hearing room, cameras zoomed in. On Warren's lowered head, her grip on the folder, the unmistakable posture of someone who once held the floor but was now being cornered by numbers, not insults. This wasn't about political attacks anymore. This was about accountability. Kennedy remained still, no longer reading charts or statistics. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. And then, with a voice that was firm but calm, he said what the whole room already felt. "This isn't just a failure in oversight," he said. "It's a betrayal of public trust." He didn't yell. He didn't dramatize. He just let the words land, solid and plain. The people who voted for us handed over their money and their trust. And what did they receive in return? A maze of secret programs, a parade of good-sounding causes that were more about narrative than need. That's not leadership, that's deception. Then, without breaking rhythm, he delivered his next move. "I am calling for a full investigation into USAID, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and every foreign aid initiative connected to Senator Warren's term in office. No more closed records. No more unexplained billions." He looked straight across the room, locking eyes with Warren. "The American people are not campaign donors. They're creditors, and the bill is past due." No one moved. Warren didn't raise her hand. She didn't argue. She just sat, still, quiet, her face pale, her eyes locked on the wood grain of the table in front of her. And Kennedy, still calm and composed, gave the final words. "Senator Warren," he said, voice low, "you weren't defeated today by politics. You were defeated by the truth." He closed his folder, took a step back, and let the moment settle. The cameras followed his quiet exit, but no one else spoke. Not right away. Every eye turned slowly back to Warren, still seated, still silent. Her political image no longer commanding. The room, now just another official figure facing questions she couldn't answer. In that silence it became clear. The most serious battles in politics don't come with shouting or protests. They begin with uncomfortable questions. And this hearing had just become one of them. As the air in the chamber thickened with tension, there was no sound, not even a whisper, no gavel strike, no dramatic outburst, just the unmistakable reality that something had shifted. This wasn't a win for Kennedy or a loss for Warren. It was a moment when performance ended and responsibility took its place. The slogans were quiet now. The applause lines had faded. What remained was a table, a folder of receipts, and the uncomfortable realization that the numbers, not the speeches, had spoken loudest of all. Even the reporters had paused. pens hovering above notepads as if unsure how to capture what had just unfolded. And still, Warren remained still. No rebuttal, no denial, just the weight of what had been exposed. Because when truth enters the room, it doesn't need to shout. It simply waits to be heard. Kennedy's folder was closed, but the weight of his words still filled the room. Warren had not spoken since the final blow. Her body remained still, her gaze fixed downward. There was no protest, no defense, just the quiet stillness of someone, confronted by something they could no longer avoid. And the most powerful part? Kennedy had never raised his voice. Around the chamber, no one moved. Staff, journalists, and aides remained motionless. The cameras, still rolling, captured not a loud conclusion, but the silence that follows a shift too significant to ignore. Kennedy hadn't listed vague concerns. He hadn't relied on emotion or dramatics. He had done something more difficult. He had read the paperwork. He had followed the money. And now, the receipts, unlike the speeches, couldn't be argued with. No charts, no headlines, just facts. He had drawn a direct line, from taxpayer to transaction to the tangled network of organizations, policies, and programs funded under the promise of good. And he had shown how, too often, those promises turned into excuses, and those funds vanished without result. As the cameras panned back to Warren, she slowly straightened her papers. Her hands still shook slightly. The senator who once filled rooms with fire and rhetoric now seemed quiet, reflective, perhaps for the first time in a long political career, uncertain of what to say. Kennedy's words still echoed. This is arithmetic, not theory, not spin, not opinion. The truth doesn't need a campaign ad. Across the country, the message wouldn't just be heard in D.C. committee rooms. It would travel beyond Capitol Hill, to town halls, classrooms, factories, and family dinners. Because Kennedy hadn't just called out a senator, he had questioned a system. The pattern was clear. Year after year, dollars left American hands, taxed, collected, and directed not to communities in need here, but to programs overseas, whose names and outcomes few could explain. When asked for justification, the responses weren't numbers. They were phrases: complex systems, emergency relief, cultural bridges. Kennedy had pushed back not by yelling, but by asking, "Where's the receipt?" And when he asked that, something shifted, not just in the room, but in how people watching might start to ask questions of their own leaders, their own agencies, their own budgets. At the end of it all, Warren was still a senator, still an elected official, still able to speak. But at that moment, the voice that had commanded attention for years was silent. Not because she had been silenced, but because, for once, the room wasn't responding to her message. They were responding to something older and harder to resist: the numbers. And the questions those numbers raised would linger far beyond the hearing. Where did the money go? Who approved it? Who benefited? And who was left behind? Kennedy had asked those questions with surgical calm. He hadn't suggested that aid was unnecessary or that compassion was weakness. What he had argued was that trust must come with truth, and when the truth is buried, accountability must dig it out. As the hearing closed, no gavel fell. The camera slowly zoomed out, not for effect, but because nothing more needed to be said. The confrontation had passed. The records had spoken. And in the space where slogans once stood, there now remained a silence filled with hard facts. Elizabeth Warren sat still, her legacy briefly held not in her own words, but in the unanswered questions now attached to her name. And Kennedy? He left the hearing room not with a victory speech, but with something far more lasting. He had simply said what others were too afraid to, and the truth, once spoken plainly, had done the rest.